You know, a lot of people talk about racial prejudice, and some people have gone so far as to say that there are actually two Americas.
White privilege. What?
Does white privilege exist? Yes, they do. I think they do, especially now.
You know, I wish I'd had some white privilege, dude. Sign me up.
So, what is white privilege?
White privilege is advantage that I got from being born white in a culture that favors whites.
A term like white privilege gets on people's nerves. I know it got on my nerves. It wasn't just the way the phrase rolled off the tongue, the implication, the tone, but it was also in how it was used as a cudgel, a blunt weapon meant to guilt and to silence. I used to fully write off this term. I have spent a lot of my life living as a minority. Not a national minority. I'm white, living in a majority white country, but throughout most of the stages of my life, I lived in places where there weren't a lot of white people. I grew up in a majority black neighborhood. I went to a majority black school. I had mostly black friends. And at one point, my family and I were the only white members of a black church. So once I started attending high school, the fact that there were only 3 or 4 other white kids in the building didn't really bother me. I was used to it by then. But I still remember the night I went to a play downtown. I had won the tickets through my high school, so myself, my mother, and my friend were able to attend what would have normally been a pricey affair. I didn't know anything about the playwright or the play itself going in, but upon entering the theater and finding our seats, I began to look around the theater. The lights were still on, and I wondered suddenly if I was the only white person there. I looked. The theater was packed, hundreds in attendance, and after a while my theories seemed correct. I couldn't find a single other white person, other than, of course, my mother seated next to me. Now, like I said, this wasn't a new experience for me, but the memory of that night sticks with me because it made me consider what it really meant to be a minority. I had this flash of self-consciousness. Do other people notice me? Are people wondering why I'm there? How do they feel about me? Do they think I don't belong? These questions were followed in my mind with, what must it be like to live with these questions all the time and at a national scale? In the years that followed, I listened to and read a lot of content and conversations surrounding white privilege, and I came to 2 conclusions. The first is, I really did believe that white privilege existed. However, I have multiple issues with how the term is being used, described, and incorporated. I don't think it's a useful term for changing society. I don't think it applies in every case. And I definitely don't think that white privilege is the all-encompassing boogeyman that it has been propped up to be by either side. The problem here is less that the 2 sides, left and right, have differing definitions, but that the advocates have played fast and loose. Each resource claiming to define white privilege leaves us more confused as explanations get more and more sloppy. In memes on Facebook, I saw friends and family make absurd claims about situations, current events, and policies, driven by this clumsy understanding. If you watched my previous video on systemic racism, you'll know that I see these conversations as bogged down with imprecisions, which in turn cause the resulting debate to stray far away from the original idea. And as white privilege as a concept is intimately tied into the philosophy of systemic racism, the same problem applies. I'm going to read now some text from the original source on white privilege. It's a bit of a text dump, but I think it's important to hear what Peggy McIntosh, the originator of this concept, meant to communicate through her trainings and workshops. So here, from Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack.
I decided to try to work on myself, at least by identifying some of the daily effects of white privilege in my life. I have chosen these conditions, which I think, in my case, attach somewhat more to skin color privilege than to class, religion, ethnic status, or geographic location, though of course all those other factors are intricately intertwined. As far as I can see, my African American coworkers, friends, and acquaintances with whom I come into daily or frequent contact in this particular time, place, and line of work cannot count on most of these conditions. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. I see a pattern running through the matrix of white privilege, a pattern of assumptions that were passed on to me as a white person. There was one main piece of cultural turf. It was my own turf, and I was among those who could control the turf. My skin color was an asset for any move I was educated to want to make. I could think of myself as belonging in major ways and of making social systems work for me. In proportion as my racial group was being made confident, comfortable, and oblivious, other groups were likely being made inconfident, uncomfortable, and alienated. Whiteness protected me from many kinds of hostility, distress, and violence, which I was being subtly trained to visit in turn upon people of color. My work is not about blame, shame, guilt, or whether one is a quote-unquote nice person. It's about observing, realizing, thinking systemically and personally. It is about seeing privilege, the upside of oppression and discrimination. It is about unearned advantage, which can also be described as exemption from discrimination. Please do not generalize from my papers. They are about my experience, not about the experiences of all white people in all times and places and circumstances. Beware of gym exercises, which position people in only one aspect of their identities, asking them to step forward or backward from a baseline at a given prompt. Keep the lists in their autobiographical contexts. I compared my own circumstances with some of those of African American women I worked with. Being clear about this will actually increase your effectiveness as a facilitator. You can say, this is from just one white woman. She's writing about herself, not you. The work goes best when you draw on participants' own personal experiences, not their opinions. Opinions invite argumentation. Telling about experience invites listening. Opinions tend to bring on conflict, whereas shared experiences tend to elicit curiosity and empathy.
Peggy McIntosh is a progressive. She's a feminist scholar and an intersectional one at that. Her interests are explicitly political. Her argument for white privilege is tied to her deeper arguments about intersectionality, critical scholarship, systems of oppression, power and privilege, and all the other buzzwords you might expect. I'm not going to pretend then that the concept of white privilege is devoid of ideological load. It is a loaded term. And though I'm going to argue that her ideas are distorted in the public sphere, I think she is both responsible and not responsible for it. She is responsible in the sense that she's happy to allow those distortions to perpetuate because it helps her ideology spread. She's not responsible in the sense that in many ways, white privilege has become overbloated and lost its distinction from other terms in the field. Let me then give you my steelman argument, my strongest and least controversial definition of what privilege means and how one might visualize white privilege. Privileges are a set of outwardly perceptible and frequently immutable traits that from an unknown contact, making a snap judgment in a given environment, afford that individual neutral or favored treatment. On an individual level, privileges usually play out like this. Because privileges don't negatively impact us, we don't think about them. But those who lack particular privileges might live self-consciously aware of those traits, and this self-awareness can become a psychological burden. I say might and can there because, of course, there are those who lack privileges, but through either chance, upbringing, or even conscious choice, do not dwell on it, or at least don't allow it to burden their thinking. Traits that can endow privilege include things like ethnicity, sex or gender, age, attractiveness, height, weight, physical condition, appearance, accent or dialect. The effect of privilege is strongest in context with strangers in neutral contexts. In fact, the effect of privilege disappears over time as a person is individuated. That is, as you talk to a person, get to know them, the imperceptible traits come to light, and a person's judgment is therefore changed. Under this definition, I'm not going to include class, primarily because it's not a visible trait, especially these days. You can have class signifiers to pretend to be a certain class, or you can dress down, but ultimately class is not fully perceptible in most contexts. The benefits of class are mostly material and objective. They're not based on these sort of subjective cultural attitudes or feelings. So in that sense, I would count class as a strict advantage, not necessarily a privilege. And an important thing to note is that privileges often manifest as the ability to be invisible, to be regarded as neutral, to not receive either negative or positive attention. Let's set up then what racial privilege might look like. Imagine two individuals entering a convenience store. These two individuals are 100% the same. And I mean entirely, from their age, sex, height, attractiveness, their hairstyle, their clothes, everything is the same. In fact, they might as well be twins. But here's the catch. One has dark skin, the other has white skin. Which individual is the clerk going to be more likely to keep an eye on, to suspect, to feel uncomfortable around? Even if we're accepting small percentages here, I think we can intuitively know it will be the dark-skinned person who is more frequently going to be the target, even if all things are equal and the person has given no signs of being a source of trouble. Furthermore, we can also guess that the black customer is the one who will likely wonder how they are perceived, or if they are being watched or suspected. The white customer might both be perceived by the clerk as just some person, a blank slate, and go about shopping without ever questioning whether his or her race is a factor in their treatment. White, then, is the neutral state, and all other states are qualified. Peggy McIntosh's description of privilege hits these qualities: that white privilege is experiential, contextual, distinct from other privileges, based on imperceptible benefits, not a totality, and not meant to be measured or debated. In other words, her description would have a person merely reflect on personal experiences so as to allow white people to think about their own race and empathize with people of other races. It's not a checklist, it's not a competition, it's not a statistical breakdown of society. It's merely a conversation starter. But people on the internet don't use it this way. So here, let me describe you some of the inappropriate and improper ways white privilege gets used by everyday people. The perfect universe problem. You've probably seen a meme like this. On one side, there's a picture of an innocent black man shot by the police for stealing a candy bar. On the other, a white man who shot and murdered 20 people but was taken in by the police alive and unharmed. This is white privilege in one image, it declares. The most obvious flaw in these memes, the one that most people will be quick to point out, is they are the definition of cherry picking. Out of the thousands of events that happen every year, this argument hand selects the two examples that make their point for them, where a broader analysis of the data would show no such pattern. You could just as easily find examples of whites killed by police over frivolous charges, or blacks arrested alive after multiple homicides. However, another and perhaps more profound error is that by placing the two stories side by side, the creator of the image is implicitly arguing that these were equivalent cases. The equivalency is argued in two ways. One, by arguing the two scenarios are so alike that we can only conclude that the outcomes differed because of race. And number two, had the races of the individuals been swapped, the outcomes would have changed. But we know neither of these things. First, no two real-life scenarios are fully equivalent. Even cases carefully selected for comparability are ultimately unique instances. They involve differences in location, age, appearance, behavior, timing, jurisdictions, involved officers, compliance, prior dispatch information, levels of threat, environments, weapons, and civilian interaction. Once you've considered as many relevant factors as you can, you'll see that these are not like my hypothetical perfect scenario. Reality, especially field data, pulled from uncontrolled scenarios, does not line up neatly. But not only are the two scenarios insufficiently comparable, the assumption that we can imagine the outcomes had races been swapped is a simple fabrication. We do not have access to this information. There is no alternate dimension mirror we can look into. What has happened in each case has only ever happened once, and you can neither recreate that event nor predict its new outcome upon tweaking a single factor. The conflation problem. Because race gets absorbed into many conversations in the United States, the most common problem with explanations of racial privilege is the wanton, reckless conflation of racial privilege with many other kinds of privileges or advantages that exist. If you've ever watched the viral video of the privilege race or looked at comics purporting to delineate the life paths of white versus non-white people, you've encountered this problem. Yes, certain traits are disproportionate racially speaking, but that does not make those traits racial. Having two parents versus one is not a racial quality. Being poor is not a racial quality. Finishing high school is not a racial quality. Not only can these things affect people of any race, they afford benefits and drawbacks regardless of who holds them. You don't have to be black to live in a single-parent household, and you don't have to be white to benefit from having college graduate parents. These are statistical probabilities of material gain, not subjective perceptions, feelings, or attitudes. This is where white privilege conversations try to merge with discussions about inequity and systemic racism, and it doesn't work. This is why McIntosh warned against these walks. It's where a lot of white people get stuck, because the reality is, of course, that some of them will have experienced these same inequities, thus confusing the issue. So if within your explanation of racial privilege you start listing percentage numbers about poverty, health, or crime, chances are you've strayed away from the parameters of the discussion. The determinability problem. Relatedly, when conversations about racial privilege acknowledge other forms of privilege, they often break down into fierce competitions about which privilege is more important. Who is more privileged? A wealthy black businessman in his 40s with a limp and a distinguished accent, or a white, blue-eyed homeless veteran who's able-bodied but burdened with PTSD, or a married, pregnant Hispanic woman working as an office clerk, or an Asian baseball player who's gay. It's sometimes called the progressive stack, this game of figuring out who has more or less privilege by adding up all the person's immutable traits and calculating some final score. But of course, reality isn't a video game. Traits are neither stable across time or context, nor do they all weigh the same, nor do they exist in isolation from each other. And the number of traits the brain can take in upon seeing a person is so complex that it's likely there are privileges we haven't identified yet. If that is all true, then how do we even begin to guess how much of treatment or attitudes is derived from a person's race? How do we separate treatment received for age, attractiveness, weight, sex, or any other traits? How do these traits interact? And how do we, at the end of the day, understand a race as an independent factor, especially when, in essence, every interaction is unique? Can we ever understand this? Is it even worth it to try? the context problem. The final problem is that conversations around privilege, racial or not, miss out on a crucial feature. Privilege is contextual. You might have white privilege in many contexts, but it is not a blank check. Much of the conversation is centered around the United States, but there are, in fact, many countries in the world where racial advantages look vastly different. And even within the US, there are situations and places where being white might prove to be a disadvantage, causing one to stick out, thereby receiving less positive attention or more negative attention. On the other hand, being Black can have advantages in certain contexts as well. However, it is still accurate and important to say that as a majority group member, there will be more contexts in which a white person will experience privilege. So in summary, white privilege does not mean that all racial disparities are caused by racism. It doesn't mean that all whites have an easier road to success. It doesn't mean that all minorities are disadvantaged in every way or in every situation. It does not mean that all minorities feel discriminated against. And it does not mean that other privileges don't matter or that they are less important. What should white privilege teach us? When someone who is different from you is sharing their suspicions, worries, or anxieties about their treatment or perception from strangers, it is tone-deaf and ignorant to reject it on its face solely because it does not match your own experiences. That is, you should not refute experiences with experiences when the two experience profiles are distinct. Your experiences are not everyone else's experiences. There are topics you never think about that others might think about all the time. I think if you can acknowledge that mentally, you're doing something valuable. You're recognizing that you have a lot of unspoken, invisible assumptions about your daily life that don't necessarily apply to everyone. White privilege has use as an empathy tool in conversation and interpersonal relationships. It is not a great diagnostic tool for larger systemic problems, nor an analytical tool for policy making. But I think if white privilege is kept very small, very confined, very interpersonal and intimate and reflective, it can retain some value. So the next time you hear a story that contradicts your own experience, maybe you can stop becoming too quickly skeptical, too combative, too irritated, too dismissive. There might be time for fact-checking later, but for now, maybe forget about trying to win every conversation and really try to absorb someone else's perspective so that you can weigh it alongside your own. The tactic won't let you dominate a debate, but it might save a friendship or help you form a closer bond with someone in your life. It may even help point out something that's normally invisible to you. So no, white privilege should not mean shut up. It does not mean a white person has no expertise, knowledge, or input. They might even have an advantage as a neutral party to judge an issue dispassionately. But that's something to figure out. Now that I've reached the end of the video, I can anticipate some resistance or even revulsion at my suggestion that white privilege does not deserve to be wholly thrown out. I get it. But let me close by making a few additional arguments. 1. Society by nature organizes itself to maximum efficiency by sacrificing the needs of the small minority groups. An efficient system cannot serve every individual without breaking down under its own weight and complexity. That American society, or indeed any society, tends to work best for the largest majority groups is a feature, not a bug. Where the minority can adapt to the majority system, I would encourage them to. Where the minority cannot adapt, it is best for society to find accommodations that are unobtrusive, fair, and effective. 2. Inasmuch as we are a republic, it is in our interest to consider the experiences and needs of the minority. Whether they are minorities in the religious, ideological, cultural, or ethnic sense, we should be empathetic to their efforts to integrate into the larger republic. Part of that empathy should include the ability to listen and see alternative perspectives, which in turn gives us valuable information. 3. Much of my criticisms of white privilege rhetoric are around its conflation with arguments about systemic racism. Indeed, if you swapped out white privilege with systemic racism in most articles, listicles, or videos, no meaning would be lost. But the concept of white privilege was invented to not be the same thing, but to coach people into visualizing their placement within said systemically racist system. This ideological concept might be distasteful to you. If that's the case, consider disentangling the phrase white privilege from the core idea, that we should, at times, reflect on how other groups might experience life differently. 4. On a prescriptive note, because society works the way it does, and because people are the way they are, there's not much that learning about white privilege can truly accomplish. It is an intimate and personal thing to acknowledge. I don't believe people are capable of tempering that much of their implicit biases. Certainly no research has shown that seminars do the trick. But there is one hack that could prove useful here: individuation. If you are a minority, lean into your individualism. In a new context that could be hostile, express yourself. Speak directly. Exhibit personality. Ask questions. Share. The more another person sees you as an individual, the more the effect of privileges falls to the wayside. And similarly, for a white person, if you are in situations where you must make snap judgments, give yourself space to think and search for individuating traits. Find out a person's stories. If you don't have that option, give them a story. That simple exercise can prevent you from simply labeling people for their superficial appearances. Anyway, I hope you found something valuable in my thoughts. Please share your own thoughts in the comments below, and perhaps see you next time.